If you're relying on yourself to help you with your growth as a Christian, Pastor John Durante has a message for you.
It's only by grace, the grace of God through faith in Jesus Christ, can we be set free. Now, if that's the way you were saved, why wouldn't it be that that's the way you continue to live? But we have this tendency, again, human flesh, thinking we can, polish what we are, make ourselves look better. We're working on ourselves. The most popular section at Barnes & Noble is what? The self-help section. Why would you go to yourself when you're the problem? And why would you let somebody else who thinks that they're the answer to the problem tell you when they're the same problem you have?
Jersey Shore Calvary Chapel presents Things Above with Pastor John Durante. We've been making our way through the book of Romans. Today we stop in chapter 7 for a look at our relationship with God. Our relationship with God is the foundation of what we were designed to be as human beings. God created us in order to fellowship with us. Why then are we so reluctant to have a close and intimate relationship with Him? He loves us. The Apostle Paul's words in Romans chapter 7 were born out of his own personal experience. And that's why his life serves as such a powerful testimony of what God can do through someone who trusts in Him. Well, let's join Pastor John in Romans 7, verse 7.
We are in Romans 7, and we're going to pick it up in verse 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law. For I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. But sin, taking opportunity by the commandment, produced in me all manner of evil desire. For apart from the law, sin was dead. I was alive once without the law. But when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment, which was to bring life, I found to bring death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it killed me. Therefore, the law is holy, and the commandment holy and just and good. Has then what is good become death to me? Certainly not. But sin, that it might appear sin, was producing death in me through what is good, so that sin through the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. For what I am doing, I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice, but what I hate, that I do. If then I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that it is good. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is, in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. For the good that I will to do, I do not do, but the evil I will not to do, that I practice. Now if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. I find then a law, that evil is present with me, the one who wills to do good. For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man, but I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, with my mind, I myself serve the law of God, but my flesh, the law of sin. So I said it last week, I'll say it again this week, because it bears remembering that these two chapters, that is chapter 6 and 7, that they're governed by three questions found internally in the passage itself. And the questions come as a result of everything the Apostle Paul taught, of course, in previous chapters, 4 and 5. And in chapter 5, the truths that, the doctrines that Paul is establishing are so overwhelming. And Paul, in stating them and teaching them in this letter, writing this letter to a group of people that he himself, most of which he's never met. He knew some of them, but not all of them. And he's wanting these people to understand this. He assumes that in hearing this teaching, namely that the law which was sent from heaven to men by God, the law itself, would bring about an aroused sense or desire to sin, and that as a result of the law, humanity would sin even more. But don't worry, he says, because where sin abounds, grace superabounds. And that we shouldn't worry because that there's more grace available from heaven than there is the accumulated sin of humankind. But Paul assumes that teaching is going to bring some erroneous thinking to the minds of the hearer as they listen to those teachings. And so he presupposes those questions, asks them in the letter, and then answers them so that we wouldn't come to those conclusions. In fact, in chapter 6, verse 1, he says, "What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace might abound?" So if God's grace is just going to increase the more we sin, why not just sin more? And then, of course, he says, certainly not, and answers the question so profoundly in the next 13 verses. And in the closing verses of that section, he tells us that we're no longer under the law. The law is no longer over us. It's not sovereign over us. We're now under grace. Grace is our sovereign in the working out of our sin. And so then he says to himself, well, now they're going to think that the law is perhaps irrelevant, and that since we're not under the law, we should still be able to sin. The next question, chapter 6, verse 15. What then? Shall we sin because we're not under the law, but under grace? Again, he answers the question, no way, Jose. No way. How shall we, who were saved from our sin, continue to live in bondage to our sin? It's a ridiculous thought. But it needs to be said. Why? Well, because as we're going to see in chapter 7, we still have the sin nature. It's still going to war against us. And that leads us to question number 3 in chapter 7 in verse 7. So he makes the point that we're not under the law. And he makes the point that the law couldn't save us. We couldn't be saved through the law. And so then he assumes, well, you know what? They're going to think to themselves, well, then the law is not perfect. And it can no longer be trusted. And maybe the law, in fact, is sin itself. Because if the law couldn't save us, there's something wrong with it. You know what? Let me tell you something. It's human nature to blame anybody but yourself. It's not the law's fault that we sin. It's our fault that we sin. Folks, you have to come to the conclusion after today's message that you're evil. Your flesh is an evil thing. I know that sounds very provocative. You're all evil. Get in line behind me, though, and get in line behind the Apostle Paul, because he's going to use himself as the personal example to show how this works itself out in his life, that every day he reconciles that one part of him is evil still as a Christian, and that it can't be trusted and it can't be lived by, that righteousness can't be achieved in that 1/3 of who he is. Critically important that we understand that there's part of us that tells us lies every single day, in order to reconcile itself in its own desires, to reconcile itself in an earthly timeline, not in an eternal timeline. And you'll notice that the nature of the first 2 questions is about what we do or don't do. The nature of the third question is about how we think about ourselves and about the law, the place of the law. There's a popular system of thinking today. It actually has a name. It's called antinomianism. I mentioned it back in January quite a bit because we were in a section of Romans that it was important. It becomes critically important today that we understand that this is permeated Christianity, antinomianism, which is the idea or the thought, well, that the law really doesn't matter. There's no reason to study or to learn the law today or the commandments. Why bother? We're under grace. It doesn't matter. It's just not a part of my everyday living. I don't relate to it. Folks, start relating to it. The place of the law is still incredibly important every day in our lives. The law, the commandments. And we'll see today that Paul actually reconciles that in his everyday life. And that's how he keeps his perspective and his thinking in their proper place. That's how he comes to the question. He says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? What are we going to say about the law to people now? What are we going to say to ourselves about the law? What are we going to say to others about the law? Is the law sin? Absolutely not. On the contrary. And now notice also he changes here, as I mentioned he would, to personal pronouns. Rather than speak about the church in general, which, we find we have a tendency to do that, right? Somebody asks us a personal question about ourselves. Well, you know what happens to us, what we do, depersonalize it. No, he goes just the opposite way. He makes it about him. He uses himself as an example. It's an excellent, excellent way of explaining something. Let me tell you how I struggle with sin, he says. He says, I would not have known sin except because or through the law. The law came and now I know what sin is. And that is the place of the law in the world. For I would not, here's an example Paul's going to use personally. For I wouldn't have known what covetousness was, or that I was struggling with it, unless the law plainly stated, you shall not covet. We attend church, we go to Bible study, we listen to Christian radio, or when we read the Word ourselves, God uses the law, the commandments, the Scriptures we'll see in Galatians 3 in a minute, to train, to teach, to keep us in His will.
That Bible on your bookshelf, it'll transform your life if you'll let it. Thanks for listening to Things Above. And don't rush away. There's more to come from Pastor John Durante. As you may know, there are some costs that go along with being on the radio like this, and we look to our listeners to help us with that. When you invest in this radio ministry today, we'll give half of your donation to the Surf Project. Take a look at surfproject.org to get an idea of what they're all about. And you can make a secure donation online at thingsaboveradio.com. Now here's Pastor John with the second half of our message from the book of Romans.
I heard somebody at the conference yesterday morning say, it's a great thing to be in the will of God, but it's not always the most comfortable place to be. In other words, that God can lead us, in fact, into places that we would never lead ourselves. He used the example of the storm when Jesus was out there in the middle of the sea. All the disciples were bailing furiously to keep the boat afloat. Where was Jesus? Asleep in the back. Like, Jesus, what are you, crazy? Can't you see we're all going to drown here? They're bowing, they're dumping the water again. Oh my gosh, we got to save ourselves. No, you don't. That's an incredible, powerful point. You don't need to save yourself. You can't save yourself. They wake Jesus up. He goes, what's the matter, you guys? Come on. Seas be still. And everything went shoo. I can save you, but you can't save yourselves. The law can show you need to be saved, but stop trying to be a Christian and start following Jesus, is what Paul learns from this passage of Scripture. Galatians 3, Paul said this to the church in Galatia, verses 21 through 25. He said, is the law then against the promises of God? Absolutely not. For if there had been a law given which could have brought or given life to humanity, truly righteousness would have been by the law. But the Scripture has confined all under sin. Everyone was confined, held prisoner. The law stood there at the bars, at the door, held the key and said, you're not getting out, not as long as I'm standing watch over you. That's what the law does. Why would we want to live under the law? The Scripture had us confined under sin that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. You see, it's only by grace, the grace of God through faith in Jesus Christ, can we be set free. Now, if that's the way you were saved, why wouldn't it be that that's the way you continue to live? But we have this tendency, again, human flesh, thinking we can, polish what we are, make ourselves look better. We're working on ourselves. The most popular section at Barnes & Noble is what? The self-help section. Why would you go to yourself when you're the problem? And why would you let somebody else who thinks that they're the answer to the problem tell you when they're the same problem you have? This doesn't come from here. The law doesn't come from here. It didn't come from men. It came from heaven. It's why it can help us. It's why it can train us. It's why when we read it, we're not reading something that we created. We're reading something that He wrote. It has power that we don't have. Goes on to say in Galatians 3, but before faith came, we were kept under guard by the law, kept for the faith, which would afterward be revealed. Therefore, the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after faith has come, we're not under a tutor. We don't need that anymore. We're not kept by the law. We're now kept by grace. But previously, while waiting for this, think about Paul's perspective. Verse 8, he says, chapter 7 of Romans again. He said, previously, sin, taking opportunity because or through the commandment itself, the commandments, the laws, produced in me all manner of evil desire. Kind of a flashback. Paul's saying in chapter 5 that when the law came, that it would cause humanity to sin more. He's saying that's what happened to me. Produced all manner of evil desire. And I like that he goes right to the source. His heart, desire, what we will, what we desire, what we want. That's evidence of what we're living according to. So what was he living according to? He said, apart from the law, sin was dead, but when the law came, sin abounded, and in him it stirred all kinds of evil desire, and it brought about in him death. Sin and death. Death is a word that the world defines one way, but the Bible defines another. Death, as the world defines it, is ceasing to exist, the atheistic perspective. Once you die, you're dirt. That's it. You're done. That's what the Bible teaches. Death is eternal separation from God, but you still exist eternally. Once you've now come into creation, you've been created. Your soul, your spirit is alive forever. Life is with Him. Death is apart from Him. Therefore, the definition of life is the presence of God for eternity. This is about practicing the presence of God every day, is what this passage is all about. I once was alive without the law. But when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. Let me ask you a question. When was Paul, think about Saul, what you know about this apostle Paul who was once called Saul, when was he ever without the law? The answer to the question is never. He was born in a Jewish household, very religious Jewish household. He was taught and trained by one of the smartest Pharisees that ever lived, Gamaliel. They still quote him today, the guy. He was one of his students. This guy knew the law better than anybody. Well, then how could the law be apart from him? How could he not have the law with him? He had the law, but he had it in a different way. You see, we have a tendency in humanity to try to look at the law and sort of tell the law what it means, according to what we're capable of doing. Thou shalt not, thou shalt. Don't do this, do that. Well, that can't mean actually what it sounds like it means because I can't do that. So it must mean something else. So we find a way to change what it means, according to what we're able to accomplish. And then we're looking to ourselves as Paul did, as Paul was taught through religion and religious theology of how to live with the commandments. But what did it ultimately do? I was alive once without the law, but when the commandment came, that is, when the law finally started commanding me, instead of me commanding the law, sin revived and I died. Sin had taken control over him, and Paul had two very wrong ideas about himself and about humanity, and was confident in righteousness he was before understanding that he was actually a slave to the law. The two wrong thoughts that Paul had that the world has today is, number one, he thought that human flesh could ascend to the law. Human flesh can never ascend to the law. That's the reason God sent it in the first place, to show us that we can never arrive at the law. The second wrong thought is that human flesh could one day inherit eternity and go to heaven with God. Those are two very wrong thoughts. Human flesh can never go to heaven. And as you're going to see as this chapter unfolds, Paul begins to sound as though he needs psychiatric help. He's like, well, I'm this, but then I'm also that. But that's not me that's doing that, right? And all of a sudden, Flip Wilson comes to mind, The devil made me do it. You made you do it. You got to take responsibility. Paul takes full responsibility for his actions in this chapter. He owns that part of himself. He says, that's still part of me, but I'm going to focus on this other part of me. And you have to understand today that you, as you sit here today, are not one thing. You are body, soul, and spirit, scripturally speaking. And 1/3 of that is your enemy. We savvy? That's your enemy. It's the closest enemy. It's the one. And by the way, think about it if you could imagine yourself, man, I wish there was an island somewhere where I could go, where there was no internet, no television, no outside influences tempting me to sin. And then I also wish on that island that there was this big bubble over it that demons can't get in, and only angels and only, that just good and positive in the Bible and good stuff. And then I wouldn't sin. Well, guess what, folks? That's a lie. You're not good. Your flesh is still going to tempt you to sin. And that's the battle. And see yourselves in a battle every single day, or you will lose. The commandment, verse 10 says, which was to bring life, I found instead to bring death. How? Why? For sin, taking occasion through or by the commandment, tricked me, deceived me, and by it then killed me. You've heard it said, I think around here a couple times, sin will take you further than you wanted to go, keep you longer than you wanted to stay, cost you more than you were willing to pay. Here's what sin says. The deception of sin says this: no one's looking. Just this once and then I'll stop. Or how about this one? It only affects me, so what difference does it make? Sin lies. And sin comes from within you. Therefore, you cannot trust yourself. Again, I sound like I need a psychiatrist now. Verse 12, therefore the law, if the law is not sin, what is the law? The law is holy, and the commandment, it's also holy. As the law is brought to bear upon us and bring conviction, it becomes to us commandment. And the law is holy, and it's just, it's justified, it's perfect, it's good. Don't think that the law is ungodly. The law is a definition of the character of God. If we couldn't satisfy the requirements of the law, if we could have, it would have brought us life. But the problem isn't the law, the problem is me. The law defines holiness and brings us to our knees in humility because we're found broken. The law finds us broken. And you might think to yourself, well, that's a terrible thing. Why would I want that? I'll tell you why. Because from that place, God can work on us. And then God can build us into something different and change us. And then, man, we become better people. Through the law, through God using it in our lives, we're brought to our knees. Now, here's what Jesus says when we arrive at that place. We're on our knees with our heads bowed in shame because we have no capability of changing ourselves. Jesus says this, Matthew 11:28. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Stop trying to fulfill the law with your flesh.
You've been listening to a study in Romans from Pastor John Durante on Things Above, the radio outreach of Jersey Shore Calvary Chapel in Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey. You can listen to this message again online at thingsaboveradio.com. And to get a CD copy of the message you heard today, call 732-892-4648. That's 732-892-4648. If you appreciate the teaching you're receiving here at Things Above, one way you can show your support is through a financial gift. And it would not only serve to help us get the word out on this station, but we'll give half of your donation to the Surf Project. Driven by a living Christian faith and a passion for surfing, this ministry seeks to encourage, challenge, nurture, and inspire people all across Ireland and abroad through innovative events, workshops, camps, and cultural exchanges. Check out the great work they do at surfproject.org. And to support this radio program, go to thingsaboveradio.com and click the online giving button. Let me also give you our mailing address. Things Above, P.O. Box 1322, Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey, 08742. Hey, we'd love to have you join us for a worship service here at Jersey Shore Calvary Chapel. Our Saturday night service is at 6:30. And Sunday mornings we worship and study the Word at 9 and 10:45. We also have a midweek Bible study on Wednesday evenings at 6:30. You'll find us at 708 McLean Avenue in Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey. For directions and more information, go to thingsaboveradio.com or call 732-892-4648. Well, we've been on the radio for quite a few months now, and we'd like to get your thoughts. Pastor John would love to hear from you. Take a moment to email him at thingsaboveradio@gmail.com. Thank you in advance. thingsaboveradio@gmail.com. And we'll get right back into Romans next weekend on Things Above with Pastor John Durante. And may God richly bless you as your mind stays fixated on things above.